Thank you, Mr. President. Civicus and Burma Human Rights Network, thanks to the High Commissioner for her update. We remain deeply concerned about the situation, lack of accountability and violation against the Rohingya people and other minorities that continue until today. Monitoring by BHRN has found the arbitrary arrest and restrictions of movement continue, and also forceful disappearance and continue to occur. On 29th April, four Rohingya Muslim women were arrested at checkpoint in An Township, and similar kind of situation happening a lot. BHRN has documented a steady increase in anti-Muslim hate speech in Burma, discrimination in the country. On 2nd April, a post on the social media site Facebook included fabricated information suggesting that jihadis support the pro-democratic activities in Myanmar. The post was liked by hundreds of Facebook users, and this kind of disinformation is widespread in Burma now. Clearly that the conditions are not in the place for the safe voluntary for the Rohingya people to return, and will not be as long as the military junta holds power. And we call on the Council to support a resolution which reflect these serious concerns. We further call on the state to take proactive steps in providing humanitarian assistance through ethnic and ceasefire areas, protect new Rohingya asylum seekers, and provide material and diplomatic support to civil society journalists and activists at the risk. And at last, the genocide with the against the Rohingya has started, but it is not going to end with the Rohingya. It has consumed more ethnic marginalized minorities in Burma. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to International Bar Association. International Bar Association, please.
Mr. President, the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, the Law Council of Australia, Lawyers for Lawyers, and Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada condemn the ongoing gross human rights violations in Myanmar, intensified following the coup. Since the coup in February 2021, Myanmar's military and police have reportedly killed more than 1,900 civilians. Over 11,000 people are victims of mass arbitrary detention, in addition to reports of enforced disappearances, torture, and ill treatment. Lawyers, judges, political opponents, journalists, and activists, all civilians, are being brought before military courts in breach of international standards. Military tribunals have reportedly sentenced 114 people to death under martial law, including 41 in absentia, through closed summary proceedings without access to legal representation and with no right of appeal. More than 18 lawyers have been arrested for defending political detainees, and the activities of lawyers and lawyers' associations have been suppressed against the UN Basic Principles on the role of lawyers and threatening access to justice. We urge this Council and the international community to ensure that these large-scale and systematic abuses are duly investigated, including an assessment of whether they amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity, including through a UN security referral to the International Criminal Court. We also urge UN member states to consider all possible actions to ensure justice and reparation for victims in Myanmar. We thank you.
Thank you. Next on my list is Association pour la défense des droits de l'homme et des revendications. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Mrs. High Commissioner, since the military coup in Myanmar, the right to life as the most fundamental of all human rights have been violated on an atrocious scale. The estimations are around 2,000 deaths, including 130 children, with these numbers very likely to be a significant underestimation, as we know that not all families have the possibility to report their losses, nor are the authorities willing to report on their killings. What is more, these numbers obscure that we are talking about human beings with stories of their own, with dreams of a bright future, torn by the reckless actions of authorities meant to protect them. In addition to reported cases of torture and rape, 13,000 persons have been arbitrarily arrested, and at least 114 persons have already been sentenced to death based on vague offenses provided in the new martial law order. Mrs. Bachelet, as provided in the report of Special Rapporteur on Myanmar, victims of grave human rights abuses are profoundly discouraged by the failure of the international community to prevent atrocities and hold accountable the perpetrators of human rights violations, especially in cases of killing and torture? What is your response to these persons, as well as to those perpetrating these abuses, to engender hope and faith in the value and bearing of our human rights frameworks and mechanisms? Thank you.
Thank you. This was the last speaker on our list. Now I give the floor back to Distinguished High Commissioner for her concluding remarks. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, colleagues and friends. At the onset, I would like to thank all delegations and NGOs for their statements and efforts to address the extremely complex situation in Myanmar. When I joined this office 4 years ago, we had hopes that Myanmar's democratic path would lead to deeper institutional, security sector and constitutional reforms, despite concerns over the reluctance to deal with impunity and the plight of Rohingyas and other minorities. My office and the various human rights mechanisms had proposed a comprehensive plan of action to support national efforts for change. Those hopes were reversed with the military campaigns of violence against the Rohingyas masking from 2016 onwards and the renewed conflict in many parts of the country. The 2020 election, nevertheless, gave renewed hopes for change. Then came the military coup in February 2021 and its devastating consequences for the country and its people. Ever since, we have been all asking the same questions. How can we, as international community, work together to address the catastrophic situation before us today, including in relation to issues of accountability, restoration of democracy, and protection of Rohingyas and other minorities? As stressed in my oral update and previous sessions, the Council, the General Assembly, and ASEAN have identified key steps needed to find a way out of this crisis. These include, first, for the military to stop acts of violence and repression. Second, release detainees, including political leaders. Third, to prevent the supply of arms and revenues to the military in line with the General Assembly resolution of June 2021 and apply targeted sanctions on military economic interests and encourage businesses operating in Myanmar to cease working with military-linked entities. Many countries are already imposing arms embargoes or restricting sales of security equipment. In his last report, the Special Rapporteur proposed a number of areas where exporting nations could go further to prevent the sale of any weapons or material that could be used to attack and kill Myanmar civilians. 4. Involve all stakeholders in the democratic movement, including NUG and ethnic groups, in devising a peaceful political solution. 5. Support international accountability efforts, including in the International Criminal Court. 6. Protect all individuals who cross international borders. Moreover, the international community should increase its efforts to ensure that humanitarian aid is available and delivered to the over 14 million people in need. Risk of the military using the delivery of humanitarian aid to access areas that are currently not under the direct control have been voiced by many interlocutors. The protection of local civil society and humanitarian workers, including UN national staff, is critical. There were also several questions on what can be done to advance protection, accountability, and redress for victims, including with a specific focus on minorities. I continue to call for accountability for serious human rights violations as well as international crimes, which have been committed in Myanmar, not only in terms of justice for victims, but as a precondition for any sustainable political future for the country. These are currently several practical measures that Member States can take with regard to accountability. First, following the example of Argentina and Turkey, states can implement or adopt legislation allowing jurisdiction for crimes committed in Myanmar on the basis of universal jurisdiction. Member States could also offer resettlement packages for individuals forced to flee Myanmar and members of the armed forces or other armed group who wish to leave are unable to provide relevant information to promote accountability. Moreover, Member States should maintain their ongoing support to the IM while also increasing financial support to my office to ensure that the documentation work my office carries out amid all challenges can continue to provide this Council with verified and accurate information on the developing human rights situation on the ground. International accountability tracks in the ICC and ICJ should be pursued. Accountability, however, goes beyond just criminal prosecution, but it includes parallel efforts to address the numerous grievances that affect the Myanmar society. To this end, Member States should ensure that any political solution to the crisis includes transitional justice measures and excuse amnesties for serious human rights violations and international crimes. Concerning the situation of Rohingya, the ultimate goal must be the creation of a conducive and sustainable and dignified return to their place of origin in Myanmar. This is true not only for the million Rohingya refugees in the camps in Bangladesh, but over the more 130,000 other Rohingya IDPs in central Rakhine State confined to camps since the earlier wave of violence in 2012. Despite previous commitments to close the ID camps in Rakhine State, the basic rights of these people, whether to a nationality, liberty and security, freedom of movement, livelihood, or an adequate standard of living, continue to be denied. There will be no sustainable solution without addressing these key issues. I agree with Malaysia and others on the importance of sustaining international support to Bangladesh in hosting the refugee population. As the situation becomes more protracted, I agree with third country resettlement for some refugees, especially those most at risk in the camps, should be explored where possible. But this should also not undermine the refugees' fundamental right to return or in any way alleviate Myanmar's responsibility to accept Rohingya people back as its own citizens. We will discuss these issues further in the dedicated panel discussion tomorrow on Rohingya and other minorities. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of this interactive dialogue. I wish to thank Distinguished High Commissioner for her participation and remarks. We shall now take a short technical break before resuming the interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner on her annual report. Can we start?
We should start. Yeah.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to ask for your attention, please. We will now resume the interactive dialogue on the annual report of the High Commissioner presented yesterday morning. I now invite interested delegations to ask questions to the High Commissioner and to make comments on her report. Now I give the floor to a distinguished representative of Lithuania on behalf of a group of countries. And I once again ask, please, for your attention. Please, Lithuania, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I have the honor to deliver the statement on behalf of the Nordic Baltic countries, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, Norway, Sweden, and Lithuania. And I would like to address the issue of human rights in armed conflict mentioned in the High Commissioner's report. There is no doubt that during armed conflict, civilians pay the highest price. Persons in already vulnerable situations are disproportionately affected, not least by sexual and gender-based violence. This is alarming. The international community has gone a long way in building up international rules-based order grounded on the Charter of the United Nations. This order is constantly challenged, including most recently by Russia's attack on Ukraine. As states bear primary responsibility to respect, protect and fulfill international humanitarian and human rights law, it is up to them to put an end to the immense suffering and irreparable harm caused by the armed conflicts. Therefore, we all urge all states to uphold their obligations under international law, ensure that civilians caught in armed conflict situations are fully protected in accordance with international humanitarian law, immediately end violence, and ensure full respect for human rights of all. Protect those in most vulnerable situations, including children and persons with disabilities, as well as women and girls, journalists and media workers, human rights defenders and other members of civil society. End impunity and ensure accountability for violations and abuses of international human rights law and violations of international humanitarian law. The human rights of each individual are inalienable. Everyone deserves justice, dignity and peace. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Netherlands on behalf of a group of countries.
Mr. Vice President, this joint statement is on behalf of 47 countries. A full version will be on the extranet. Madam High Commissioner, we are gravely concerned about human rights in Xinjiang, China. Numerous reports indicate that over 1 million people have been arbitrarily detained. Ongoing surveillance and discrimination, and severe restrictions on Uyghur culture and freedom of religion or belief. Further reports indicate torture, forced sterilization, sexual and gender-based violence, forced labor, and forced separation of children from their parents. We repeat our call on China to implement the CERT's recommendations on Xinjiang and address concerns raised by special procedures, including on arbitrary detentions. We remain gravely concerned about deteriorating respect for human rights in Hong Kong and human rights in Tibet. We urge China to comply with human rights obligations, to ratify the ICCPR, and to provide independent observers, including special procedures, access to Xinjiang. Finally, we acknowledge your recent visit to China, including Xinjiang, which provided an opportunity for dialogue, and we acknowledge your recent statement, Madam High Commissioner. We are interested in more detailed observations, including on the restrictions China imposed on the visit, on your access to civil society and places of your choice. High Commissioner, recalling your announcement at HRC 48 that you would release a report on Xinjiang, we look forward to its prompt release. Could you please provide further information on the timeline? I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to European Union.
Thank you. Mr. Vice President, I have the honour to speak on behalf of the European Union. We condemn Russia's unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine. We support accountability for violations of human rights and of international humanitarian law in Ukraine. It is Russia's war of aggression which has disrupted global food chains. Food security remains a priority for the EU. In Russia, the crackdown on human rights continues to escalate. In Belarus, the scale of internal repressions is worse than ever before. We urge China to respect, protect and fulfill human rights for all, including in Xinjiang, Tibet and Inner Mongolia. The EU calls upon the Office of the High Commissioner to release the report on Xinjiang. In Hong Kong, we remain concerned about the national security law and the changes in the electoral system. In Afghanistan, we are concerned about the erosion of human rights, especially of women and girls. On Venezuela, we commend the work of the High Commissioner and the FFM. The EU regrets the deterioration of respect for the rule of law and human rights in Turkey. As regards Egypt, we remain concerned about restrictions to civil society. The EU commends Libya for cooperation with the fact-finding mission and supports the renewal of this mandate. We remain concerned about the violence in the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel. We condemned the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Luxembourg on behalf of Group of Countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the 55 members of the Group of Friends of the Responsibility to Protect. We thank the High Commissioner for the work of her office in highlighting human rights violations and abuses around the world. Such violations and abuses, especially when paired with other exacerbating risk factors, such as limited civic space or high levels of political, social and economic instability, can be an indicator of potential atrocity risks. Therefore, the UN human rights system plays a fundamental role in preventing and responding to atrocities. To further strengthen the role of the UN human rights system in the structural prevention of atrocities, we urge the High Commissioner to systematically include atrocity prevention measures in technical assistance provided by her office. In this regard, the UN framework of analysis for atrocity crimes can be an important tool in identifying a country's individual protection gaps. The United Nations human rights system can and should also rapidly react when situations are at imminent risk of escalation. In this regard, we call on the High Commissioner to make systematic and regular use of intersessional briefings for Member States when her office identifies situations at risk. We also call on the High Commissioner to work closely with the United Nations Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect, mandated to provide early warning of atrocity crimes, to identify areas to strengthen cooperation and coordination, and to alert concerned states and the wider international community of necessary action in light of deteriorating crisis. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Republic of Korea on behalf of Group of Countries.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the core group of the resolution on new and emerging digital technologies and human rights, namely Austria, Brazil, Denmark, Morocco, Singapore, and my own country, the Republic of Korea. We thank the High Commissioner for presenting her annual report, which addresses critical human rights issues during these challenging times. We especially appreciate the OHCHR's activities in mainstreaming human rights throughout the work of the United Nations on digital issues. In particular, we welcome the OHCHR report on the practical application of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, or UNGP, to the activities of technology companies, which was presented to this Council session based on the expert consultation that took place in March of this year. We appreciate that the report tackles the human rights risks connected to new technologies in a comprehensive manner, as well as the challenges of implementing human rights due diligence in the technology sector. We hope that OHCHR will continue to play its leading role in optimizing digital transformation through respect for human rights based on multi-stakeholder cooperation. In closing, Mr. President, we look forward to collaborating with the OHCHR for the next expert consultation on human rights and technical standard-setting processes for new digital technologies. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Cuba on behalf of Group of Countries.
Gracias, señor presidente, señora alta comisionada. Tengo el honor de intervenir en nombre de un grupo interregional de 69 países. Respect for sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of states, and not interference in internal affairs of sovereign states, represent basic norms governing international relations. Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Tibet-related issues are China's internal affairs. We oppose politicization of human rights and double standards, or interference in China's internal affairs under the pretext of human rights. We maintain that all parties should abide by the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, adhere to the principles of universality, impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity, and respect the right of the people of each state to choose independently the path for development in accordance with their national conditions. All human rights should be treated with the same emphasis, with sufficient importance attached to economic, social, and cultural rights, and the right to development in particular. Today, human beings are faced with multiple challenges, including the COVID-19 pandemic. The international community should uphold multilateralism, strengthen solidarity and coordination, and respond jointly to global challenges, advance world peace and development, and promote and protect human rights. Thank you, Mr. President, Madam High Commissioner. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Côte d'Ivoire on behalf of Group of African States.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. J'ai l'honneur de prononcer cette déclaration au nom du groupe africain. Le groupe africain remercie la haute commissaire, Mme Bachelet, pour la présentation de son rapport annuel et la félicite pour son leadership et son engagement en faveur de la promotion et de la protection des droits de l'homme dans le monde. Le groupe africain félicite également le Haut Commissariat aux droits de l'homme pour le travail accompli sur le terrain et les progrès enregistrés dans le domaine des droits de l'homme. Toutefois, le groupe note que la situation des droits de l'homme reste préoccupante dans certaines régions du monde, notamment dans un contexte marqué par la pandémie de la COVID-19 qui a exacerbé les inégalités et les écarts existants entre les marginalisés et les privilégiés, y compris l'accès aux vaccins. Par ailleurs, cette pandémie a révélé les insuffisances des systèmes sanitaires et socio-économiques face à des crises sanitaires mondiales. Aujourd'hui, plus que jamais, la coopération multilatérale est d'actualité si nous voulons répondre aux défis de portée mondiale. Nous devons nous accorder sur notre engagement commun afin de trouver en urgence une solution à l'aggravation de l'insécurité alimentaire. Aussi, nous demandons à la haute commissaire de souligner l'importance de la solidarité internationale face à la crise alimentaire croissante. Par ailleurs, le groupe africain salue le programme commun et le nouveau contrat social des Nations Unies qui font de la protection sociale et de la couverture sanitaire universelle des priorités mondiales essentielles pour faciliter l'accès aux soins de santé, protéger les personnes contre la pauvreté et garantir la jouissance des droits économiques et sociaux fondamentaux. Enfin, le groupe africain voudrait appeler l'ensemble des États au renforcement de la coopération internationale en vue de faire face efficacement aux défis actuels et de prévenir les crises futures. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I give the floor to China on behalf of Group of Countries.
Mr. Vice President, Madam High Commissioner, I have the honor to speak on behalf of more than 30 countries. The full text will be uploaded to Extranet. We are deeply concerned that in recent years, the Human Rights Council has become increasingly politicized and confrontational, and disinformation has become rampant. We wish to highlight the following points. First, equity and justice. Multilateral human rights mechanisms should abide by the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, promote the common values of humanity, and oppose double standards and politicization and instrumentalization of human rights issues. Second, openness and inclusiveness. Solidarity needs to be strengthened with constructive dialogue and cooperation carried out on the basis of equality and mutual respect. Third, objectivity and impartiality. Multilateral human rights mechanisms need to work on the basis of authentic and objective information and respect the sovereignty of states and the human rights development paths chosen by each and every country in light of its national conditions. Fourth, geographical equity. The staff composition of multilateral human rights mechanisms should reflect the principles of equitable geographical distribution and absorb more talents from developing countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And this was the last speaker that we could accommodate for this meeting. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the meeting. We will reconvene this afternoon at 3 p.m. to resume the interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner on her annual report. I hereby close the third meeting of the 50th session of the Human Rights Council.